Solving quadratic equations via factoring. A quadratic equation is an equation of this form right here. Now the a, b, and c are constants, and in order to be a quadratic equation, the a cannot be 0. So here are a couple of examples. This is a quadratic equation. I've replaced a, b, and c with constants. Now this is also a quadratic equation. Notice for this quadratic equation, I've allowed my b term to equal 0, which is why you don't see a term with an x in it in between. Also, my a term, it doesn't have to be a whole number. I put a fraction. It can also be a decimal. Now, sometimes you'll see an equation that doesn't quite look exactly like this form I've shown you, but it actually is a quadratic equation as well. So for example, if I have something like 7x squared equals 3x plus 2. This is actually a quadratic equation, and it's a quadratic equation because if we just subtract 3x and 2 from both sides, we can put it in this form: 7x squared minus 3x minus 2 equals 0. So it's actually in the quadratic equation form. So this video focuses on how to solve quadratic equations, or how to figure out all the x's that satisfy a quadratic equation. Now, there are two common ways to do it. One is via factoring, and the other is using quadratic formula. So we're going to do this via factoring. So how do you solve a quadratic equation via factoring? What you do is you first make sure that your quadratic equation is in this form. So it has to be in this form. Where you have 0 on one side and then your ax squared minus bx or plus bx plus c equals 0. After it's in this form, you want to factor it. Okay, so you're going to take the stuff on the left here and you're going to factor. So this equation factors into, let's see here, we put a 9 and a 1 and a minus and a plus. Now, what do I mean by factor? You write it in this form where when you FOIL it back out. So if I were to FOIL this back out, you get exactly what you see in the previous line. So we can double check that. If I do x times x, I get x squared. Then if I do x times 9, I get minus 9x. And if I do 1 times x, I get plus x. And if I do 1 times negative 9, I get minus 9. So this gives us x squared minus 8x minus 9 equals 0. And we've factored correctly. Now, there are lots of ways to factor. I usually do factoring by inspection, and that is where I put these two parentheses here and I figure out what numbers would have to go into these 4 spots. So what would have to go here, 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 and here in order for everything to multiply out to give what you see right here. Now, what is the, how do I even go about approaching what goes in what spot? Here's the way that I do it. So I'm going to erase what I have in these spots here for you and show you. So what I do is I first look at what I see right here. So I look at this x squared. And the two things that go in these 2 spots, they have to multiply together to give you x squared. So that tells me that I need to put an x and an x. Next, I look at this number at the end, negative 9. And what goes here and what goes here, they have to multiply together to be negative 9. So that gives us 2 options, 3 and 3 or 9 and 1. And when you do this by inspection, you're going to basically kind of stick the numbers there and then multiply out to see which 2 numbers give you the correct middle term. Okay, now, if we factor, we get x plus 1 times x minus 9 equals 0. where do we go from there? We use this thing called the zero factor property. So there's this thing called the zero factor property, which basically says that anytime you have two things multiplied by each other and they multiply together to give you 0, in other words, we have this thing times this thing equals 0, you have to have either one of them, or like one of them at least, has to be 0. So this means that either x plus 1 equals 0 or x minus 9 equals 0. Why? Because two numbers only ever multiply together to give you 0 if one of them is equal to 0 at least. It's called the zero factor property. Now from there, we can solve each of these equations independently. So what I mean by that is if I solve for x on the left, I would just have to subtract 1 on both sides to get x is equal to -1. And then if I solve for x on the right, I would have to add 9 to both sides to get x is equal to 9. Now these two numbers, they are our solutions to the original equation. So if we plug in x equals -1 or x equals 9 into the original equation, we get that both sides are equal. So I'm going to zoom out and show you guys what I mean by that. If I were to stick x equals -1 into this x spot, this whole thing simplifies to 0. And if I stick 9 into this x spot, the whole thing will simplify to give you 0. So you can actually check your answer by doing that.